Hello! In this Unity tutorial, we're going to cover how to create your first terrain. To get started, go ahead and open up the Unity Hub on your computer. Once open, go ahead and create a new Unity project by selecting on the blue New button. In this menu, assure the 3D option is selected. Go ahead and give the project a name, such as My First Terrain, and then select a location such as the C drive or the K drive for storage, and then go ahead and click the blue Create button. Alright, now that Unity has gone ahead and opened, let's go ahead and get started on creating that terrain. One of the first things that I like to do when getting my scene set up is let's go ahead and get some assets in here that we plan to use on the terrain. If you don't see the Asset Store next to your Game View tab, go ahead and go up to the Window menu in the upper left-hand corner, drop down and select Asset Store. If you hadn't had a chance to see our Asset Store overview video on this channel, please take a moment to view that video, as it's going to provide you with a general overview of how to use the Unity Asset Store interface. Before getting started in here though, just double check to make sure that you're signed into your Unity account, as you'll need to be signed in to be able to download assets. Let's go ahead and search for some terrain assets, so we'll just type in terrain and see what we find. Let's go ahead and make sure that we're also viewing the free assets. Of course, you can definitely choose to purchase some of the amazing assets on the Asset Store and support the developers around the world. But for the purposes of this tutorial series in the course, we definitely wouldn't expect you to do that. So we'll go ahead and select the free assets here. Now, there's too much to talk about for the purposes of this video. I'm just going to highlight a few of my favorite ones. The first one that I would recommend you download is the Terrain Tool Sample Assets. This was developed by Unity Technologies themselves. Go ahead and download this, and then we're going to import it into our project. Okay, now that that's imported, let's go ahead and click the Back button up in the upper left-hand corner of the Asset Store tab, and we'll continue viewing what we have in the Asset Store. I recommend the Dream Forest Tree asset, as well as the Microsplat. I'm actually going to go ahead and download this. This is an amazing little set of textures and shaders that you can use in your projects. There is a bigger version of this called Mega Splat that I've used in several of my projects. There's also the Relief Terrain Pack 3, as well as a bunch of other quite pricey but high-end AAA graphics, such as Vegetation Studio and Vegetation Studio Pro, as well as the Gaia series. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about those, please reach out to your instructor or contact me directly here on YouTube. If you ever download a package and you notice that this window comes up for API update required, there are a few things that I'd like to talk about in respect to this. It is important to make sure that when you are downloading a Unity package, you check the install dependencies before you install the package. This is especially true with your larger packages that have requirements such as other packages, perhaps post-processing, or standard assets. Those two are pretty prominently known for breaking projects when they get imported. It is strongly recommended that when this comes up, you exit out of this window, go ahead and make a duplicate of your project or back it up in some fashion on a separate drive, in the off chance that when you import this, it really does break your project. So for the purposes of this, though, I know this one's not going to break it, so I'm going to go ahead and select No Thank You, and then it will continue importing the package as thus. Alright, now that that's downloaded, let's go ahead and go back to our scene view. Of course, we could spend a lot of time in the Asset Store downloading assets, but we may come back to it in the future. Okay, so looking at our hierarchy in the left side of our screen, we have two things inside of our project. We have the main camera, which is going to allow us to be able to see our terrain, and then we have the directional light as well. The directional light simply is acting as a sun source that's going to illuminate our terrain. We have a separate video on the channel talking all about lighting, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the different types of lights. Okay, so the First thing we're going to do is to create a terrain. Go up to the Game Object menu and the top left File menu. From here, drop down, select 3D Object. From this menu, select Terrain. Alright, so that is going to generate a giant checkerboard, and you can see by rotating around, holding down the right mouse button, that will allow you to pan your view around. Again, the right mouse button. We can see if we zoom out using the mouse wheel that this is a rather large terrain square. By default, I believe it's 1000 by 1000. We can double check that. With the terrain selected in the hierarchy, you'll notice the properties of the terrain in the inspector on the right hand side. The first thing we're going to do is check the Terrain Settings tab. In here, if we scroll down and look at all of these settings, in the mesh resolution settings, we have the terrain width and the terrain length. They are set to 1000 by 1000. Let's actually go ahead and bring those down a little bit to something like 250 by 250. Just to make our terrain a little bit smaller to deal with. Of course, you can make the terrain as large as you want, and we'll talk about connecting terrains in just a moment. Alright, so we have this giant square that we're going to work with, and this is going to serve as the foundation for our terrain. So to get started, after we've set the length and the width, let's go ahead and take a look at the options for it. Again, with the terrain selected, the first thing we're going to do is take a look at these options. Create neighbor terrains, that is the first one. With this selected, what this is going to allow you to do is create neighboring terrains by clicking the edges to create these terrains. If you notice, when you put your mouse over the scene view, it's going to kind of look like a box. If you were to break a box down, you'll have the boxes on all four corners. You can go ahead and left click anywhere in these areas, and it's going to allow you to create new terrains, and you can create as many as you want, and you can apply the same operations to all of these different terrains. Here in the hierarchy, you can see that each time when I was clicking, it was creating a new terrain, and the location of the terrain is also a part of the name of the object. So you can see that this one is negative 250x00, which is this one here, because this one is at the 000 position. So this one is over negative 250 units or meters. I'm going to go ahead and undo all this, because for the purposes of this video I don't need this many terrains. We'll just stick with the one terrain, but that is how you add additional terrains very quickly to your Unity scene. The next thing is the Paint Terrain option. Go ahead and select on that. If you drop this down, there are going to be so many different options that you can select from to modify your terrain. We're going to go through each of them here. First is the Raise or Lower Terrain option. If you select on the Raise or Lower Terrain and put your mouse cursor over the terrain, you'll be able to see a preview of the operation that you're about to perform on the terrain. Before we actually perform these operations, let's read a little bit more about the commands. If you left click, that is going to raise the terrain, so let's go ahead and do that. When we left click, we're raising the terrain. Let me press Ctrl Z a few times to undo that modification. If you hold Shift, you can lower the terrain. Okay, so let's hold down Shift, and we're clicking, but nothing's actually happening. The reason why nothing is happening is because our terrain is already at a base level. We're going to have to raise our terrain up first before we can actually dig down into it. I personally don't know why Unity chose to do it that way. However, when you see us raise it up, we'll come back to this operation and cut some crevices into the terrain. One important thing to note is the brushes that you're going to use, and this is going to apply to all terrain modifications that you choose. You'll see all of these different brushes that we have here, and terrain stamps as well, that we get from having the additional Unity Terrain Sample Asset Pack downloaded. There are some great ones in here, like the Terrain Mountains. If we wanted to make this a little bit bigger, let's move on here to the brush size and opacity. So the brush size, as its name implies, is going to allow you to scale this up quite big. Let's go ahead and bring that down just a little bit, and if we were to click, notice that if we hold down the middle mouse button, aka the scroll wheel, and we can pan this around, we can see how we kind of indented the terrain and put this stamp onto it. So there are so many amazing combinations that you can do by doing this. You can kind of see here how that's working out. So already we have an immensely more detailed terrain, something that's going to be much more exciting for the player to be able to walk around on and interact with. Okay, now the opacity, again, if you highlight over each of these, it's going to give you a brief message about what they do. Of course, you can find all of this information in the Unity documentation online, but Unity does its best to help out new users as you're learning the tools. So opacity is going to be the strength of the applied effect. So it's currently at 100, so it's going to give you the full effect when you click and apply this modification. If you were to bring it down to a value of 50, it's only going to apply half of the effect. So it's going to give you a little bit more fine control, precision over your terrain modifications. Alright, so we've made this terrain look really nice now. We've added some detail to it. Now we can actually go back, well, not go back per se, but we're going to try that previous modification that we did. I'm going to select a different brush, maybe this built-in brush 3, and now let's go ahead and actually reduce the size to a little bit bigger. And let's zoom in on our terrain just a little bit. Now if we pick an area that's elevated like this, and we cut into it now, if you hold down Shift and left click to lower, you're going to notice how we can actually cut a ravine into the terrain, and that wasn't possible before until we actually raised the terrain up. One of the things that people like to do right off the bat when creating the terrain is a handy little trick is to go down to the set height. Now the set height function, let's go ahead and set this to maybe like a value of 30. And then we're going to go ahead and you can either choose flatten tile, which is going to be the single tile that you are currently working on, or you can flatten all of them, which in this case we only have one, so we'll just select flatten all. Now, unfortunately, that got rid of a lot of work that we just did, which is really unfortunate. If you want to take this approach, that's going to be the first thing that you're going to want to do is set the height. We set the height to 30, and right away that's going to allow us to actually, let me go back here and use the raise or lower terrain, and let's select a bigger option. Now if we hold down Shift, we're going to be able to cut into our terrain where we couldn't previously do that because the terrain was already at its base level. Okay, I'm going to Control Z that because I actually like the terrain that I had before I did those modifications. Again, this is the point at which you start playing around, so if you want to pause the video and take a moment to play with these new tools, the raise and lower and set height. Paint holes, very nice as well. As its name suggests, it's going to essentially cut a hole into your terrain. Now, it is not the best tool. It's something that was very recently added to the Unity terrain system, but it will allow you to cut holes into the terrain. So if you wanted to do like an underground cave or something of that nature, this will cut a hole into your terrain, but it's not like it's going to function as a cave system. If you just left it the way it was, the player would just kind of fall through the map and keep falling forever. You'd have to surround the opening of the cave with a prefab just so that it gives the illusion that it's a cave, but it's actually just a hole in the terrain with a prefab slapped up right next to it, so you wouldn't know the difference. There are tools on the Assets store that do the terrain hole system justice. If you search for Digger or Digger Pro, they are a little bit expensive. Digger Pro is 90 bucks, Digger is 60 bucks. I strongly encourage the Pro version if cutting caves into your terrain or being able to make cliff overhangs is very important to you. Absolutely amazing tools. I own both of them, and I strongly recommend them. If you need help, please reach out to me, and I'd be more than happy to help with that. Okay, so that's a little bit about what the holes does. Again, that's a newer feature inside of Unity. I'm going to Control Z that just because I don't want holes in my terrain. Probably the one that people have the most fun with is the paint texture. So as its name implies, the paint texture is going to allow you to put some color onto your terrain so that we're not essentially working with a giant chessboard here, or a checkers board too. So the reason why we downloaded the Microsplat and the samples pack is so we could get some terrain assets, and let's see if they came with some textures that we can use. So if you go here, the first thing you're going to need to do is select the Edit Terrain Layers, because we have to create some layers. So we can, if you kind of think of it like a blank canvas, for example, a artist paints onto the canvas, that's your first layer, then they paint on it again, that's their second layer. The exact same concept applies here to the terrain. We can put layers on top of each other and really just paint the terrain in any way that you can imagine. But we have to create a layer because we don't have layers at the moment. And when you do that, depending on the assets that you downloaded, yours may look different than mine. This is what I have available to me. So if we scroll through here, we can try and see what we have. I think one that I'm going to choose is this Moss Albedo. Let me go ahead and double click on that one. And then when you double click on that one, it's going to automatically texture the entire terrain with that texture, because that is going to be your base layer. So now our terrain already looks 100 times better just after adding that one layer. And you can imagine it's going to look a lot better too when we start adding more layers. Some examples may be, let's go ahead and select this Cliff Albedo. And now what we can do is, with this layer created, we need to select on it so that you can see the blue underline, and then we're going to be able to paint with this terrain. Now I just want to talk about one property here, the normal map. Let me see if this has one. So this does have one. Your normal maps are going to be a bluish red type image, and this is going to provide you with some noise information. It's going to give the texture a more realistic bumpiness to it, so it's not just a static, flat 2D image. But it does that in the way of how it refracts light off of the texture. So the texture itself is not really becoming bumpy. It's just the image properties that are being applied to the rendering engine are giving the appearance of a bumpy texture. So if we were to actually zoom in and look at our ground very closely, you'll notice a significant difference on this terrain. If we select a different layer though, oops, I think I put it on the wrong one there. Go ahead and put, so does this Albedo one have one? Doesn't look like it has one. We could probably use that one and it would look just fine. See, if you take a look at it now, it has a much more grainy, bumpy approach versus if we were to actually get rid of that normal. Typically, if you download something off the asset store, it's going to come with the normal maps. If we select none, you can see immediately how that changes. So I'm going to leave that on there. This one wasn't built specifically for this texture, which is why it's going to look a little bit wonky. But it still looks, it's a great improvement over what we had previously. Okay, so I'm trying to get to this one here, but if we select on this layer, and with our brush, we can go ahead and actually start painting with this layer. So, as you can imagine, this is where we just kind of start having fun, and we can really start painting onto our terrain. So, at this point, we can use the same tools as before. We have the brush size down in the lower right hand corner, as well as the opacity. And if we wanted to, for example, create a path that went around our world, we could do it just like that. Very rudimentary path, but go ahead and fill in our gaps that we missed. This is not going to look very beautiful for just doing this on the fly, but if you spent some good time with this, this would actually look amazing. Your path right there. Perfect. And at this point, go ahead and add some additional terrain layers, and you can really start having some fun. You can get some really weird looking ones like this one here. I don't know why you would want that, but you could definitely do that. Alright, moving on here, we have smoothing height, so let's go ahead and select that one. As its name suggests, it's going to allow you to smooth the height of your terrain. So let's actually zoom in a little bit here and take a look at this area. So we have our brush size set, we have the opacity set to 100, and we have our blur direction set to 0. You hover over that, it's going to say blur only up 1, only down -1, or both. So how do you want to actually blur? If we go ahead and just click by default, you can see how it is actually smoothing out the terrain very nicely. So if the terrain is very bumpy, you don't want that many bumps. Look at how that is getting rid of those bumps. Of course, we can change the opacity, which is going to be how much is going to be applied. So I have my opacity down to about 11, and you can see as I'm running over it, holding down the left mouse button, it's just barely applying to that terrain. If we zoom in though, you can see the effect actually taking place. It's just very light. If we change the blur directions, we can see how that affects it. Let me go ahead and crank that opacity back up. This is going to smooth it by doing a lowering operation. So if I wanted my road, for example, to be smoother than the terrain around it, perhaps I could run over this just like that. Okay. So that is the smooth height, a little relatively straightforward. The last one is one of the most popular ones as well, which is the stamp terrain. And this is where you can download some amazing asset packs on the asset store, which are going to include a bunch of stamps that you can use on your terrain. So we can take a look at some of these here. Let me select a random stamp, such as this one. And then we can take a look at the brush size. I'm going to go ahead and increase that brush size to something a little bit bigger and maybe a little bit smaller. And then what is our stamp height? Okay, let's set that to a value not 0, so maybe something like 10. And do we want to add? So do we want to blend between the nodes as we're going? Probably. So when we do that now, we can actually go ahead and stamp these different things onto our terrain. So it's going to give our terrain a much more awesome looking. This is already looking 100 times better than what we had before. We could create a really nice storyline where the character has to walk through this mountain path, maybe face some creatures as they're going. And we're going to actually walk on this terrain in just a minute, so I hope you're excited for that. Alright, so I could sit here and play all day with these brushes because I think they're so much fun. But go ahead and play with the brushes. Go ahead and search as well for terrain brushes or terrain stamps on the asset store. You can find a whole bunch of them on there. The star one is a little bit weird. It's quite literally going to put a star onto your terrain. I don't know why you would want that, but we'll Control Z that. This is looking really good though. Now, as good as this terrain looks already, it is missing some other details, like where's the grass? Where is the sky? Where are the trees? So let's go ahead and get into that. So the next button here is the Paint Trees. So we're going to go ahead and click to paint trees. Well, that doesn't work. The reason why it doesn't work, of course, is we don't have any trees defined just yet. Let's see if we have any trees. So we're going to go ahead and select the Edit Trees menu, and let's go ahead and select Add Tree. That's going to bring up the Add Tree menu. From here, select the little circle next to the tree prefab, none game object. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like we have any trees at all. So that's not cool. So let's actually go to the asset store now. And what we're going to download is, let's go ahead and download standard assets. So go ahead and search for standard assets. This will be by Unity Technologies. Go ahead and download and import this into your project. Okay, now that the standard assets has done importing, if you take a look at the console tab, you may have a bunch of errors as well as a bunch of warnings. Go ahead and click the clear button. Now most of them should go away. In some cases though, they may not go away. In this particular case here, it says that this GUI text is obsolete. It has been removed. Use UI.text instead. Well, we need to update our packages to the latest version of Unity. So what we're going to have to do is go ahead and open up this script. So go ahead and double click on it. That's going to open up Visual Studio by default. Now this is going to look complicated, but I promise it won't be too big of a change. Unfortunately, because this package is from 2017, it is a few Unity versions behind, so we will have to make this small change. All we need to do here is change this from GUI text. Go ahead and remove the GUI portion in front of it so that it just says text. Now we're going to have to also import unity.ui, or unityengine.ui, excuse me. So go ahead and copy that line but put .ui after it. And that's all the change that we need to make to this. Go ahead and Control S or File Save All to save this script, and then go ahead and exit out of Visual Studio, and let's see if that made this a little bit happier. Okay, if we go ahead and click the clear one more time, that error should have gone away. That should be the only error that you encounter when downloading standard assets. If it is not, however, please leave a comment down below or reach out to your instructor for additional help. Okay, so what we were doing was in our Scene View tab, we were on the terrain in the hierarchy, and we were seeing if we had any trees. So we'll select the Edit Tree, Add Tree. We'll go ahead and click the little circle next to Tree Prefab. And if we scroll down, now we see we have a bunch of game objects in here that we didn't have previously. And there are a few trees included in here by default. Let's go ahead and select the conifer desktop tree. Go ahead and double click on it. Then select Add. Now that tree should appear here. And we're going to go ahead and start painting these trees now. So with the brush on the Unity terrain, if you go ahead and click, you're going to get a very big forest with a lot of trees. I encourage you to try and walk through that. I don't think that's possible. Let's go ahead and Control Z that. What we're going to do instead is, let's go ahead and increase our brush size, make it quite big in fact. And what we're going to do is, we're going to definitely decrease that tree density. Ooh. And let's go ahead and paint those on now. So now if we just do a few clicks here and there, in just a matter of seconds, this terrain is full of trees. Now the issue is, they look great, but they're going to be on our road. We don't want them on the road. Like, this one is pretty close to the road. I'm pretty sure that I saw a few actually in the road, and that's not how, well, like this one for example, we don't want our roads to have trees in them. So what we're going to do to solve this is we're going to go ahead and bring our brush size down quite a bit, down to like 3, so it's very small. And in the description it says we click to paint trees, and then we hold Shift and click to erase trees. So let's go ahead and hold down Shift on the keyboard, and then we can click on the trees that we want to delete. So this, at this point now, we just got to kind of go around our road, see all the different trees that are on our road. So we definitely don't want, if we were driving a vehicle, to hit any of those trees on the way. So this is looking really great so far. Now the great thing about using the Unity terrain, although it has its limitations, it is quite optimized. So using these trees will be very helpful. The grass especially is optimized. If you were to build this yourself using a procedural generation technique, you would have to account for all the optimizations that Unity already has built into its terrain. I know I get asked quite a bit previously when we discussed Digger and Digger Pro, how do I dig caves and overhangs into my terrain? I would encourage you to use that system if you need to do that, because it uses the default Unity terrain and is already highly optimized for that. But that's about as much as I'll do for adding trees onto the terrain. Let's go ahead and see what else we can add. If we go to the next tab, we can go to our Paint Details. Now the Paint Details is going to allow us to paint smaller details. It could be grass, it could be bushes, rocks, etc. Let's go ahead and select a brush that's not the star, so this circle will work nice. and then select the Edit Details, and let's add a grass texture. So again, Edit Details, add grass texture, and then from here, in the Detail section, let's go ahead and click that little circle again, and from here, you're going to look for a grass texture. So examples of grass textures would be one of these two. Let's go ahead and select this one, double click on it. You can set some properties here. I'm going to leave the default values, but this could be for stuff like the minimum width, maximum width, height, and max height, because Unity is going to automatically randomize these values just so your grass is not exactly the same, so it does have some variation to it. And then you can toggle between some colors. Again, I'm going to leave all the defaults and go ahead and click Add. And just like before, let's see what happens if we just go ahead and click. So my settings are already set up nicely. With my brush size, let's actually make that a bit bigger, max it out. Opacity set to an extremely small value, 0.001. The reason why is if we were to crank that up, you're going to get this. And although the Unity terrain is highly optimized, this is a lot of grass. This will probably run just fine still, but I would not recommend having that much grass in your Unity project, as it will consume a decent amount of memory. So I'm going to go ahead and Control-Z that. I'm going to go back to my 0.001, but again, go ahead and play around with it and see how things work out for you. I don't want to tell you not to do something. The best thing you can do in Unity is experiment and see what works out with your project. So this is still a lot of grass, but it's nowhere near how much grass we had previously. Now the same issue is we have grass on our road. We don't want grass on the road, so let me find my road buried in this grass. There it is. And let's go ahead and reduce our brush size to about the size of the road, and then we'll just go ahead, and if we hold down Shift, we can click to erase details. So let me go ahead and increase the opacity all the way up, and then we're going to hold down Shift, and at this point we're just going to go ahead and clear this grass off the road, because if we have this much grass growing through our road, we did not design this road very well. Alright, so this is where the time-consuming part kind of comes into play, and this is where we get really fine control details over all that good stuff. Alright, so that's good enough for what we're doing. This is already looking immensely better than when we started this terrain. The final tab here is the terrain settings, which we kind of already talked about. I'm not going to cover all of the details in here. For the purposes of this class and this tutorial, go ahead and leave all of these settings at default. Things you likely will change though are the wind settings, so how fast you want the wind to blow your grass, and what is your terrain width and length. Alright, so the next thing I'd like to do is add a skybox. So to add a skybox, let's go up to the Asset Store and let's search for skybox, just like that. And then let's go ahead and make sure to also select the free assets. Now a skybox, as its name implies, is going to be a six-sided texture that's essentially going to wrap around your world. That's going to give the impression of a sky. There are some amazing assets on the Asset Store, such as WeatherMaker and WeatherMaker Pro. If you take a look at those assets, those will give you some real-time, like rain systems and snow systems and all of that. This is just going to give us the appearance of a sky for this video. But you can take a look at and download any of these skyboxes. Let me go ahead and select one here. We'll go ahead and pick this one. Okay, so we'll import that into our scene. Okay, now that that's imported into our scene, we can verify that by clicking on the project window in the lower left-hand corner. And if you go back up to the top level assets, we should be able to see in here, there's our skybox folder. So to be able to add a skybox, let's go ahead and first we'll go back to our scene view tab, and then we're going to select on window, then select Rendering, and then Lighting Settings. In this menu, this is going to bring up a lighting menu. And you'll see the skybox material is a default skybox, and it's using that directional light that we talked about in the beginning of the video as the sun source. If you click the little circle next to the default skybox, you can take a look at what skyboxes or materials you have available to you, and you can click through them to see what they're going to look like. So I selected a bright pink one, but the issue is it is not a supported skybox material, so it's just going to turn our sky pitch black. Rather, let's go ahead and use this skybox cube map here. If you do that, you'll be able to click through these and see how they work. Let's actually select a nice bright blue day. I think that'll look nice. And if we zoom up, we can actually see the sky. Let's go ahead and close this out. So that looks really nice. Okay. So then what we can do is the standard assets also came with a first-person controller that we can use. We'll be learning how to program our own custom first-person controller, but for the time being, go ahead and go to the standard assets, into the characters folder, first person, then select prefabs, and then here you'll see the first-person controller. Go ahead and drag and drop that into the scene. With it in the scene and it's selected in the hierarchy, put your mouse into the scene view and press F. F is going to focus in on that object. Go ahead and press W. W is going to automatically select the Move tool. And then let's just bring it up a little bit and over a little bit. This is going to allow us to be able to make sure we're above the ground so we don't fall through the ground. It's essential that we are above the ground, so double check to make sure that your capsule is actually fully above the ground. And then let's go ahead and play this now. So if you go ahead and press the play button, let's see what happens. Alright, so we're in our world now. We can see the skybox is actually moving, so that looks amazing. We have our grass. We're rather short though, compared to everything that's going around. But this is going to give you a really quick way to get into your scene and get walking around in under 10 minutes or so if I wasn't blabbing so much about all this amazing stuff. But now you can go ahead and explore the world that you just created, hopefully clean it up a little bit better than I did, but just for the purposes of this video. And that is about it for what I would like to cover in this part 1 of our Unity terrain tutorial. If you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out in the comment section below or reach out to your instructor for any further questions. Thank you very much.